sometimes people let their biases get in the way of properly evaluating a claim. And sometimes that bias manifests as people rejecting a claim they should accept. And other times it shows up as accepting a claim that you should actually be more skeptical of. So I ran across this on my Facebook feed. Someone had posted a link to a claim by PETA, the People for Ethical Treatment of Animals, that said that vegan poop is the gold standard for fecal transplants. So, without getting too graphic, there are some people who require a fecal transplant because they have a bacterial infection or something has in some way depleted their normal intestinal flora. So they need a donor to give them the proper intestinal flora. And it's actually done by a lab. They freeze dry it, they prepare it, it's put in capsules, you swallow the capsules. Don't make your own smoothie at home, that's gross. So anyway, the claim is that vegans, for various reasons, have better poop than everybody else. And so I like going to primary sources, so I decided to do some more investigation here. And what I found is that there's actually no real data that supports that. It was actually some speculation by some proponents of vegan diets and a blog post by one of those guys that resulted in this claim. And they even made the claim that the two labs that are actually soliciting, donors are basically asking for vegans to donate. It turns out that's not true. One of the labs thanked PETA for basically mentioning their lab and giving them some free publicity, but they did not actually solicit vegan donors. And in fact, that's not actually how it works. Basically, they choose donors based on a number of variables. Diet is not actually one of them.
Wow, I would not have guessed that.
They're looking for a specific bacterial count and a specific type of bacteria, and they match that to the patient apparently.
Okay.
Because it could be that you live comfortably with a particular kind of bacteria that would be very dangerous for someone
right.
who's immune compromised or something like that. And so your diet is not really a factor in how they choose a donor.
Yeah, that's interesting. I just, as an aside, I had a friend who spent a lot of time in India, and I remember one time he had some kind of testing done, and they basically tested for the, feces for some reason, and they said, where have you been?
Yeah.
Right? Because there was a lot going on.
Yeah. Well, and apparently variety is a good thing. So eating a variety of foods is apparently a good thing because that promotes like a variety of bacteria.
But even depending on where you live can have input into what is normal.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
Absolutely. And so anyway, so what they said is that one of the spokespeople for one of the labs said that as for whether or not vegans are particularly worthwhile sources, he said, I wouldn't agree, too many variables to consider. So, so this is
and that's in Popular Science? What is that article?
It is in Popular Science. Let me get the title of the article here, and it says, PETA thinks vegans should donate poop to those in need.
Okay.
There's just one problem with this plan.
But don't let that stop you from donating.
Yeah. If you live near one of the labs, you can make up to $13,000 a year donating your poop.
Nobody's saying that you have poop that shouldn't be donated.
Right.
So go
and you know what? Even if you're rejected as a donor, I'm sure your poops are fabulous, and I know you're very proud of them, but, so don't feel bad.
Yeah. It's an interesting poop discussion.
Yeah. And we're about to turn this into a real shit show.
So somebody posted this on your page?
Yes.
Okay.
Actually, a relative...
Or your wall, I guess.
Yeah,
feed.
a relatively... it was on her wall, so
right.
It showed up on my feed. She's a relatively recent convert to veganism and is apparently grasping at whatever things she can to promote this, and she's become kind of an evangelist over it.
But you're right. We see this in like tons of areas, right? It's not specific. There is no. I'm not going to say that there aren't certain groups that. I was going to say there is no group but there are some groups that are more inclined to promote certain things, that might not be entirely correct. But in all areas and on both sides, you can get crap that people, no pun intended, that people think is accurate. And there can be people who have, like we always say, you can have the right conclusion for the wrong reasons.
Right.
And so that can happen where a person is actually correct about something, and it doesn't really matter insofar as their reasoning didn't get them there.
Right.
Poor reasoning or poor sources or lack of skepticism can still result in a right answer, just for wrong reasons.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and we have recent episodes of this in the news where people, they wanted things to be true or not true, and allowed that need for something to be true or not true to guide their.
We did see that, and that was another thing where it just came down to preferences, to whether or not it was like you saw people doing the same thing based on which side of the aisle, right? It would be if you're on the wrong side of the aisle, then you're not telling the truth. If you're on the right side of the aisle, we should believe you, and that's the wrong reason to believe or not believe a person, is whether or not they're affiliated with you in some way.
One of the things to take a look at when evaluating a claim is whether it's a trivial claim or something that's fairly common. If it's uncommon or trivial or common and not trivial, or, and in the case of, like, if I tell you I had eggs for breakfast.
Yeah, we use that one a lot.
Yeah. So, what evidence do you need of that?
Well, here's some red flags that I notice. Like when I open an article and it's saying something that sounds a little bit too good to be true, and I like that as a matter of course, one red flag for me is it sounds too good to be true.
Right.
So if it sounds a little too good to be true, and I go and I look, and a lot of times I will go and look. If I don't recognize a source, my first thing that I do is go and see if I can find reputable sources that are reporting the same thing. So if you don't recognize a source, or if it looks like it's some kind of a secondary or third-dairy source, you might want to just go and check and make sure that this is being published somewhere with a better reputation, just to kind of get an idea of where it's coming from. The other thing is if they don't cite sources.
Right. Yeah.
If there's no sources cited, so if they're reporting on something, quoting things, and they're not telling you, they're not naming people, they're not telling you where they got this information, where they reached out to, who told them this, where can I go to find information, a study said, or a recent survey. Where's the link to this survey? Where's the information on this study? Because there are a lot of things that are published in peer-reviewed journals that are peer-reviewed as crap. Right? So the peers go in and shred them. So it's not just about, finding out where it came from, but you want to know where it came from so that you can then, like you said, go and look at the primary source. Let me go and look at this study. How was the study done? Was it a survey, or did they do controls? And the other thing would be, is how was it received? Were there a lot of subjects? Was it 20 people, or was it, 40,000? How many people are involved in this study? So there are a lot of factors that can make a big difference. And it could be that a particular study is done and it's interesting and groundbreaking. Maybe there was something that was found in this study, a correlation that is kind of weird that they didn't expect. And so what that means is more studies should be done, right? We need to corroborate this by testing it again, by looking at these controls, by devising other forms of tests, or just repeating it to see if we keep getting this result, or if this was the multiple, the 4 coin heads in a row that just happens at, sometimes. So there's a lot of, if you don't see a source cited, if you can't go back and find that study or find that person being quoted or find that citation. You know, a lot of times you get quotes and you go and look it up, and it's like, nope, that's not correct. Yeah. That's a huge thing. Not naming who you're quoting, you know, just saying, and there are, I don't mean to say that just because a person isn't named, it doesn't mean that the quote is discounted. So you have to weigh things, right? So there are a lot of times when you have pretty big players with fact check behind them, doesn't mean they're going to be perfect. Oh, and I hate that so much, right?
Yeah.
So you have some great organization with a great fact check team with a great reputation, and then something comes out and they publish something wrong or even egregious on an occasion, and suddenly somebody wants to go back to this incident instead of, you know, the decades that they have been publishing reliable news. And anyone can screw up, anybody can make a mistake, a journalist can be given awards, and then you find out he has made the whole thing up. It happens.
Yeah.
Right? But the fact is, larger outlets with fact check crews are generally going to be better positioned to be reporting factual information. If you can't find it repeated at a good, valid source, you know, if you've been convinced that sources that have robust fact check are not trustworthy and secondary and, you know, third-hand sources are, you've been hoodwinked.
Yeah. Well, and you know, a really good example of that is the latest, you know, the anti-vax thing that's been going on for over 20 years now. I mean, it was originally it really took off when Wakefield published that study that he did in, I think it was the British Medical Journal or something.
Yeah, it was horrible.
And so, I mean, that was published in a reputable peer-reviewed journal.
Right.
And several years later, this journal retracted the study, and then he was actually, Wakefield actually lost his license to practice medicine because of how shoddy the research was, and how unethical it turned out to be. And it turns out he had conflicts of interest that he never disclosed, and there were all kinds of problems. And yet there are still people who accept that original study without, you know, I guess they acknowledge that it's been withdrawn, but they claim that there was some big conspiracy with Big Pharma, and they invent all this other stuff to justify what they already want to believe.
Right.
And so
we see the same thing with, you know, the circumcision study, the circumcision and HIV link, right? And that original study not taking into account the religious leanings of particular groups that circumcise for in Africa, people circumcise more for religious reasons than they do here in the U.S.
Right.
So we don't think of it as a religious ritual, but if you're involved with religious groups that also have severe sexual restrictions, you're going to end up with skewed data. So what happened there was researchers in other countries decided to rerun that study where they were. And they got such a huge mix of results, right? Like all over the map. Some of the results were backwards. Some of the results were similar but not as extreme. Some of the results were the same. It didn't matter. I mean, seeing it repeated was a huge thing. And the fact that researchers were willing to repeat that survey to say, you know, do we see a correlation where I live between circumcision and HIV? Because if it's a direct link, if it's a causal link, it should be the same everywhere, and it's not.
Yep. And you know, that's another one of those things where you don't really have to think very hard to figure out there might have been something wrong with that study, because in the U.S. we have the highest rate of male circumcision for any, you know, Western civilization outside of Israel. Yeah. And also one of the highest HIV rates in that group. So, you know, obviously, if circumcision is protective,
the other huge, not even, you know, I don't even know if I'd call it it's not a flaw with the study, but the huge problem with that study was the idea that the underlying suggestion that you should have sex without a condom, in, you know, a country that is ravaged by HIV is just completely unethical. I mean, I couldn't believe that.
And of course, since those studies were published, we've discovered that the best way to prevent the transmission of HIV is to have someone on the antiretrovirals and
use a condom.
And if you can get your viral load down to undetectable levels, you will not be able to transmit the virus anyway.
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't know that, for example, condom use it's extremely good at stopping the transmission of the HIV virus.
Right.
And it's better than stopping the transmission of herpes. Mm-hmm. You know, so your odds of getting herpes with a condom are, you know, substantially greater than your odds of getting HIV with a condom because of the way it's transmitted.
Right.
So it's interesting, and even with that, it's still low, right? I mean, I think condoms are like 50% effective with regards to herpes, and but it's 50% effective with a very small transmission rate. You know, as long as you're not having sex when there's an outbreak.
Right.
But there's a whole lot of information that you can skew information, or there's so many ways to distort information. And correlation causation screws people up so badly. They'll see something that correlates, or there's a correspondence between two things, and suddenly in their head, they do the causation, right?
Yep. And so I guess the moral of the story is if you like something a lot, that's when you should be the most skeptical of it.
Yeah, just check don't just throw down a link, right? Don't just throw out a meme because it feels good. Like go and see where it came from, right? I had somebody on my wall that I had to let go that came right out and said, I don't care if we're lying about these things because they're GOP and they're crap, and so if we need to lie and I'm like, you know, if they're bad enough, you don't have to lie.
Right.
If something is bad and egregious enough, I don't have to make stuff up. Like I can just show what's there. And if I can't find enough to actually demonstrate good reason to be opposed to something, you know, and then I shouldn't be lying about it.
Right. Well, not only that, but if somebody from the other side of the political aisle from me does something that I wouldn't condemn from someone on my side,
right,
then I'm not going to point a finger at them for doing that thing.
Yeah.
And so we had a recent case of, you know, someone who was sexting with a girlfriend.
It was horrible.
And it was all consensual and everything. She wasn't underage. She was apparently around the same age or whatever, but certainly adult, able to consent to this. They were sexting. Some pictures got exchanged.
Well, they actually had consensual sex a couple times.
Yeah. And so, and then she decides that because he's a conservative politician that she's going to release these intimate photos to basically ruin his reputation.
Actually, it was after they broke up.
Yeah.
And so it was just, this was not even a politically motivated thing. It just happened that he was a politician, but the fact is, she was just like revenge. It was just
it was
pure revenge, right?
Yeah.
And I was really glad to see his response, which was, if you think you can, then go for it, because I think you're about to commit a crime, and she may have.
Yeah. And so, I mean, revenge porn is bad whether it's being used against, you know, someone you don't like or someone you do like. So.
Yeah. And for me, the moral of the story is if you're being blackmailed, tell the person to just go ahead and let it go.
Yeah.
And then try to get them charged with blackmail.
Yep.
Or sue them for blackmail. I don't know if it's civil or criminal, but just, you know, make your life an open book and let that person pay for their crime.
Absolutely.
Unless you committed a crime, in which case then you might have to think about it. I don't know. If it's a crime, that may not be the best advice.
Maybe. Yep.